Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a truly fascinating historical analysis. We're going to be exploring the people who crucified Jesus. Now, there is so much to cover here, so we're actually producing this in two parts, part 1 and part 2. And what we're going to discover is that the cross isn't just some ancient execution tool. It's actually a profound psychological mirror reflecting human nature, our human nature. Because on the hill of Golgotha, it wasn't just about one man's death. It was this massive collision of human desires, fears, ideologies, and choices that all pointed in one incredibly tragic direction.
Here's exactly what we're going to cover in part 1. We'll start with the mayor of Golgotha, then look at 4 distinct groups: the chief priests, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Scribes. Finally, we'll wrap up by looking ahead at who is next.
To really set the stage for this analysis, we have to understand the fundamental disconnect of that era. Matthew chapter 15, verse 8 says, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." You see, all the groups we're about to discuss spoke endlessly about God. They spoke about the law, the temple, justice. But practically speaking, the God they actually worshipped was one entirely of their own making.
And the truly tragic outcome of that false worship is captured perfectly in John chapter 1, verse 11, which tells us, "He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him." Because they were clutching so fiercely to the idols they had built, when the actual living God stood right before them, they couldn't even recognize him. Worse, they saw him as a threat that absolutely had to be eliminated. So let's look at exactly how this played out.
Section 1. The chief priests and their religious system.
Now, the chief priests were meant to bridge the gap between God and humanity. But the contrast here is just staggering. While they loudly claimed to serve the Almighty, they had actually turned the temple from a place of divine encounter into a massive, lucrative economic system. Make no mistake, their true God was temple-centered religious power, honor, and extreme wealth.
And they held on to this with an iron grip. The high priesthood was completely dominated by the families of Annas and Caiaphas. They controlled the entire temple economic structure, and their absolute primary goal was passing this immense wealth, honor, and religious privilege down to their children, generation after generation.
But then Jesus steps onto the scene. Matthew chapter 21, verse 13 records Jesus saying, "You are making it a den of robbers," as he actively cleansed the temple. Jesus didn't just disrupt their business for a day. He declared that he himself was greater than the temple. By cleansing it, he threatened to dismantle the very religious system that had become their literal God. They were so furious that their wealth and power were at risk, they actually became the ones who took the lead in plotting his crucifixion. So we have to hold that mirror up to ourselves. Are we prioritizing our church systems, our structural traditions, and our community influence over Jesus himself? If things like religious influence and institutional honor take priority over Jesus in our lives, we are effectively crucifying him all over again.
Moving on to Section 2. The Sadducees, focusing on wealth and power.
The Sadducees were the political and economic elites of the day, and their loyalties were incredibly divided. While they claimed to serve the God of Israel, they actually worshiped political power, wealth, and honor. They heavily collaborated with the Roman Empire to enjoy and maintain their social privilege. Within this political system, they possessed massive wealth and status, and they used it to secure the absolute best educational opportunities for their children, keeping that elite social privilege intact for generations. Theologically, they were strictly bound to the physical world. Acts chapter 23, verse 8 notes, "The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection." We see this play out directly in Matthew chapter 23, verses 23 through 33. Remember that famous resurrection debate? They try to trap Jesus by asking whose wife a woman will be in heaven after having 7 earthly husbands. They asked this specifically because they completely rejected the idea of a resurrection. Well, Jesus fiercely rebuked their ignorance of the scriptures and the power of God. By preaching a new and visible kingdom and his own resurrection, he completely shattered their comfortable reality-based worldview. To protect their earthly empire and their god of political power, they decided he simply had to die.
Let's look in the mirror again. Are we trusting in our jobs, our money, and our social status more than the invisible God? Do we obsess over giving our children worldly success and elite education while ignoring their spiritual reality? If we do, we are falling into the exact same trap as the Sadducees. Section 3. The Pharisees and the Snare of Self-Righteousness.
The Pharisees were essentially the beloved middle class of the era, highly respected because they prided themselves on perfectly keeping the law.
They deeply, deeply cherished the Pentateuch and the entire Old Testament. But over time, a really subtle shift occurred. Their stated God was the lawgiver, but their actual God became their own accumulated self-righteousness. At the exact same time, economically, as a middle class, they sought collective power and explicitly controlled commercial areas. So, their God had actually become their own moral pride paired with economic power and money.
They had a very precise system. Master the law to build a fortress of personal pride, use their network to consolidate middle-class commercial power, and then intentionally pass this strict lifestyle of rule-keeping and economic dominance directly down to their children.
But Jesus saw right through this facade.
In Matthew chapter 23, verse 27, he ruthlessly rebukes them, saying, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites!" As Romans chapter 10, verse 3 later explains, they sought to establish their own righteousness, completely ignoring God's. Jesus essentially dismantled the very foundation of their societal pride. Stripped of their self-righteousness, they were so deeply infuriated that it drove them straight to murder.
So we have to ask ourselves, is our faith based on a humble reliance on Jesus, or on the religious achievements and the moral scorecards we've built for ourselves? Are we crucifying Jesus by letting our own spiritual pride and our money sit on the throne of our lives?
Section 4. The Scribes, the keepers of knowledge and tradition. The scribes were the intellectual gatekeepers. They valued the law in the Old Testament, but they also piled on layers of human interpretation. They practically worshipped the traditions of the elders, these complex legal frameworks like the Midrash, the Mishnah, and later the Talmud. They viewed these traditions as more precious than life itself. They lived with immense pride in their mission and their knowledge, constantly copying and transmitting these exact interpretations down to their descendants for generations. Their God was the law, the traditions, and the mere knowledge of them. But listen to how Jesus responded. In Mark chapter 7, verse 13, he fiercely rebukes them, saying, "You nullify the word of God by your tradition." And in John chapter 5, verse 39, he points out that they diligently study the scriptures thinking they have life, yet fail to realize those very scriptures testify about him. Jesus exposed that they just worshipped information about God rather than the living Lord himself. Infuriated by this unmasking of their intellectual idolatry, they joined the plot to execute him. This is a really piercing question for any of us who love to study theology. Are we acting like the scribes? Do we substitute deep theological knowledge and correct doctrine for an actual living relationship with Christ? Section 6. Who is next? Looking ahead to Part 2. We've seen how these four powerful groups use the cross to eliminate a threat to their personal idols. But the story of Golgotha is far from over. In Part 2 of this explainer, we're going to examine the Zealots, the zealot party of violent revolutionaries. We'll look at the Herodians, who desperately tried to continue the glory of the Herodian dynasty. We'll explore the Roman officials who promoted the propaganda that Rome brings happiness. And finally, we'll look at the ignorant crowd who, being completely incited by their religious leaders, just blindly shouted to crucify Jesus. We'll uncover exactly why all these wildly different factions joined forces in his crucifixion. Until next time, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder in your own life. When you strip away all the religious language and the Sunday routines, what are you making into your God right now? Is it your wealth, your status, your traditions, or your pride? Thank you for exploring this with me, and I'll see you in Part 2.